The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban street. Daisha Williams, a bright, 14-year-old girl, strolled home from her music class. Her violin case hung loosely in her hand. Swaying with her light steps, she hummed softly to herself, a tune she had been practicing for weeks. It was her favorite part of the day, just her music, and the golden light of early evening. As she approached the corner of Maple Avenue, a patrol car slowed to a crawl beside her. Daisha barely noticed it at first, too absorbed in her thoughts, but the sharp voice that followed jolted her out of her daydream. "Hey, you!" barked Officer Tom Henderson, a middle-aged white policeman with a stocky build and a demeanor that screamed authority. He leaned out of the car window, his aviator sunglasses glinting. "Stop right there." Daisha froze, her heart pounding. She turned slowly, clutching her violin case tighter. "Yes, sir?" she asked cautiously, her voice barely audible. "What's in the bag?" Henderson demanded, stepping out of the car. His heavy boots thudded against the pavement, and his hand rested ominously on his holstered gun. It's just my violin," Daisha stammered, lifting the case slightly as if to prove her point. Her mind raced. Why was he stopping her? She hadn't done anything wrong. "Don't get smart with me," Henderson snapped. "Where are you coming from? And where are you going?" "I was at music class," she replied, her voice trembling. "I'm just walking home." But Henderson wasn't satisfied. He circled her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Music class? Huh? What's your name?" "Daisha," she whispered. "Daisha what?" "Daisha Williams." "Where's your ID?" he demanded, his tone sharp and accusing. Daisha faltered. I don't have one. I'm only 14. Henderson's eyes narrowed. 14. Huh? And you're just walking around here alone? You look suspicious. Tears pricked at Daisha's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said softly. "Don't you tell me what you did or didn't do." Henderson barked. His voice was loud now, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. "People like you are always up to something." Daisha's chest tightened at the weight of his words. "People like you." She didn't need to ask what he meant. The humiliation stung worse than his tone. "I'm going to need to search your bag," Henderson said, before she could protest. He snatched the violin case from her hands and unzipped it. The delicate instrument gleamed under the fading sunlight, nestled in its soft, protective lining. Henderson's face contorted, as though disappointed not to find something incriminating. "Next time, don't walk around acting suspicious," he spat, shoving the case back at her. Daisha stumbled back a step, clutching her violin. "Can I go now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Henderson stared at her for a moment longer, then waved her off dismissively. "Yeah, get out of here. And don't let me catch you loitering again." Daisha turned and hurried away, her legs trembling with every step. She didn't stop until she was home, slamming the door shut behind her. Her mother's worried voice called out from the kitchen, but Daisha couldn't answer. She collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. The golden glow of the evening now felt cold and distant. The Williams household was usually a place of warmth and laughter, but tonight, a heavy silence filled the air. Daisha sat on the couch, her violin case untouched beside her. Her father, Marcus Williams, towered in the living room doorway, his military uniform crisp and imposing. His broad shoulders and stern expression reflected years of discipline and command. "Daisha," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" Through halting sobs, Daisha recounted the incident. Her mother, Angela, sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, her own eyes brimming with tears of anger and sadness. Marcus's jaw clenched as he listened, his hands curled into fists, his knuckles white. He had spent years serving his country, believing in justice and equality, only to hear his daughter's voice shake with fear as she described her ordeal. That man, Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. That man had no right to treat you like that. Angela nodded, her grip on Daisha tightening. This is unacceptable. Marcus, something has to be done. We will, Marcus said firmly. I'll make sure of it. The following morning, Marcus sat at the dining table with his laptop open. He crafted a post detailing what had happened to Daisha, his words sharp and deliberate. He included no personal attacks. But the message was clear. This was an injustice that could not be ignored. Within hours, the post went viral. Thousands of people shared it, expressing their outrage and support. Comments flooded in, ranging from heartfelt empathy to vehement calls for reform in the police force. News outlets picked up the story. Reporters called the Williams home, asking for interviews. Marcus declined most requests, choosing to focus on gathering evidence and preparing for what he knew would be a long battle. Across town, Tom Henderson sat in his small, cluttered apartment, the television blaring in the background. The news anchor spoke of the viral post, showing a picture of Daisha's smiling face beside her violin. Tom scowled, muting the TV. He knew he was in trouble. His superiors had already called him in for a meeting, and the department was launching an internal investigation. He felt the walls closing in around him. Tom wasn't always this way. Growing up in a small, predominantly white town, he had witnessed his father's bitter anger toward minorities. That anger had seeped into him, shaping his worldview. Over the years, his job had only reinforced his biases. Every crime scene, every arrest, seemed to confirm what his father had told him, that people like Daisha couldn't be trusted. But now, sitting alone in his apartment, Tom felt a gnawing sense of unease. The girl's face haunted him. She hadn't been a criminal. She had been a scared, innocent child. And yet, he had treated her as though she were less than human. For the first time in years, Tom began to question himself. But the weight of his past choices hung heavy, and he didn't know if he could face the truth. The Williams family sat together in the living room, a map of the city pinned to the coffee table. Marcus had spent the day contacting his connections, old friends from the military, community leaders, and even a few sympathetic politicians. His training as a colonel in the army had instilled in him a strategic mind, and now, he was putting it to use in an entirely new kind of battle. This isn't just about Daisha, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. This is about ensuring that no one else has to go through what she did. Angela looked at him, her expression a mix of pride and worry. Marcus, I support you, but this could get messy. The police won't take this lying down. I know, Marcus replied, his jaw tightening. But they've messed with the wrong family this time. Daisha sat quietly, listening to her father's resolve. She admired his strength. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she wanted all this attention. Part of her wanted to move on, to forget the encounter ever happened. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the officer's face, heard his sharp words. The pain lingered like a wound that refused to heal. I want to help, she said suddenly, her voice small but steady. Marcus turned to her, his stern expression softening. You don't have to, sweetie. Your mother and I will handle this. No, Daisha said, shaking her head. This happened to me. I want to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Marcus nodded, a hint of a smile breaking through. All right, then, we'll do this together. That night, Marcus drafted an official complaint to the police department, demanding an internal investigation into Officer Henderson's actions. He also began organizing a town hall meeting to discuss the broader issue of police misconduct. He knew it was only the beginning, but he was determined to see it through. Tom Henderson sat in a cramped conference room at the precinct, his stomach in knots. Across the table sat Chief Sarah Bennett, a seasoned officer with a reputation for no-nonsense leadership. Her piercing blue eyes bore into him as she flipped through a stack of papers. Officer Henderson, she began, her tone cold and measured. I've received multiple complaints about your conduct. But this is different. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Chief, I was just doing my job. The girl looked suspicious. Suspicious? Bennett raised an eyebrow. She was a 14-year-old carrying a violin case. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tom muttered, avoiding her gaze. Bennett slammed the folder shut, making him jump. Do you even hear yourself? This department has spent years trying to rebuild trust with the community. And now, because of you, we're back to square one. Tom clenched his fists under the table. With all due respect, Chief, I think this is being blown out of proportion. The media's twisting the story. Bennett leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You're not the victim here. Henderson, that girl is. And if this investigation finds that you violated protocol, which I'm almost certain it will, you'll be facing disciplinary action. As she left the room, Tom felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, he began to realize just how serious the situation was. While the world around him buzzed with activity, Marcus found himself haunted by memories of his own struggles. Late at night, after Angela and Dacia had gone to bed, he sat alone in his study, staring at an old photograph of his military unit. In the picture, he stood tall and proud in his uniform, but he could still remember the whispers, the sideways glances, the way some of his peers had doubted his abilities simply because of the color of his skin. One memory stood out among the rest. It was his first year as a junior officer. During a training exercise, his commanding officer had singled him out, questioning his competence in front of the entire unit. Are you sure you belong here, Williams? The man had sneered. Maybe you'd be better off back home, doing whatever it is your kind does. Marcus had stood his ground that day, completing the exercise flawlessly. But the sting of those words had never left him. He had spent his entire career proving himself, not just as a soldier but as a leader. And now, seeing Dacia face the same prejudice, he felt a fire reignite within him. He opened a notebook and began writing. Not notes for the investigation, but a letter to Dacia. He wanted her to know that she wasn't alone, that she came from a line of fighters who never gave up. The letter was raw, filled with stories of his own battles and the lessons he had learned. As he wrote, Marcus felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This wasn't just about justice for Dacia, it was about changing the system for future generations. The following week, Dacia returned to school, nervous about how her peers would react. She had seen the news coverage, read the comments online. Some people supported her, while others accused her of exaggerating or seeking attention. The uncertainty weighed heavily on her. But as she walked through the hallway, something unexpected happened. Her classmates began clapping. One by one, they approached her, offering words of encouragement. Dacia, you're so brave, said Mia, her best friend. We're all behind you. The support bolstered Dacia's confidence. And by lunchtime, she felt ready to face anything. That afternoon, her teacher invited her to speak at an upcoming school assembly about her experience and the importance of standing up against injustice. At first, Dacia hesitated. Public speaking wasn't her strong suit, and she didn't want to relive the trauma of that day. But then she thought of her father, of the stories he had shared with her. If he could endure years of prejudice and still hold his head high, so could she. On the day of the assembly, Dacia stood on the stage, her heart pounding. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and even a few parents. She gripped the microphone tightly and took a deep breath. When I was stopped by that officer, she began, her voice shaky at first. I felt scared, humiliated, and powerless. But I'm here today to tell you that we don't have to feel powerless. We can stand up for ourselves and for each other. As she spoke, the crowd grew silent, hanging on her every word. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The applause was deafening, and for the first time since the incident, Dacia felt a glimmer of hope. She realized that her voice was her strongest weapon, and she intended to use it. The sun was setting over the city as a crowd gathered in the community park. Word had spread about Dacia's story, and Marcus's call for action had galvanized people from all walks of life. Activists, families, students, and even local business owners had come together to demand justice. Signs with bold slogans like "Justice for Dacia" and "End Racial Profiling" waved in the air as speakers took turns addressing the crowd. Dacia stood off to the side, holding her mother's hand. She felt small amidst the sea of faces but also overwhelmed by the support. For the first time since the incident, she realized she wasn't alone. "Marcus, you're up next," said an organizer, handing him a microphone. Marcus stepped onto the makeshift stage, his imposing figure cutting a powerful silhouette against the fading light. He scanned the crowd, his military training evident in his posture and measured tone. "Good evening," he began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly over the murmurs of the crowd. "I wish I could stand here tonight and tell you this is an isolated incident, but it's not. It's part of a larger problem, a system that allows people to act on their biases without accountability." The crowd erupted into cheers, some waving their signs higher. "My daughter, Dacia, is 14 years old," Marcus continued, his voice breaking slightly. "She's a musician, a student, a dreamer. She did nothing wrong. Yet she was humiliated and dehumanized. This is not the world I fought to protect when I served in the military. This is not justice." Dacia felt a lump rise in her throat as her father spoke. She had always known him as strong and stoic. But tonight, she saw a side of him she hadn't seen before: vulnerable, passionate, and unwaveringly protective. After Marcus finished, the organizer invited Dacia to join him on stage. Her heart pounded as she took the microphone, her hands trembling. "I just want to say thank you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for standing with me, for standing with my family. What happened to me was scary, but knowing all of you are here makes me feel brave." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing into the night. Dacia stepped off the stage feeling lighter, as though she had shed some of the weight she'd been carrying. The Williams family wasn't the only group watching the movement grow. At the precinct, tensions were brewing. Officer Tom Henderson sat in the break room, scrolling through social media posts about the rally. Every comment calling for his dismissal felt like a dagger to his pride. "They're making a circus out of this," he muttered, tossing his phone onto the table. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you pulled that stunt," said Officer Carla Ramirez, a younger colleague who had been watching the case unfold. Tom shot her a glare. "You don't know what it's like out there. You can't trust anyone. And that includes a 14-year-old girl?" Carla retorted, her tone sharp. "Face it, Henderson, you messed up." Before Tom could respond, Chief Bennett entered the room. Her stern expression silenced the room instantly. "Henderson, in my office, now." Tom followed her down the hallway, his stomach churning. Inside her office, Bennett gestured for him to sit. "The department is under fire because of you," she began, her tone icy. "We've launched an internal investigation, but the evidence is damning. Body cam footage, witness statements, it doesn't look good." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Chief, I was doing my job." "No," Bennett snapped. "Your job is to protect and serve, not humiliate and profile. Until further notice, you're suspended without pay." Tom opened his mouth to protest, but the look on Bennett's face stopped him. He stormed out of her office, slamming the door behind him. As the investigation into Tom's actions deepened, more troubling details began to surface. Marcus had enlisted the help of a private investigator, a sharp-witted woman named Tasha Gray, who specialized in exposing corruption. "Marcus," Tasha said one afternoon, handing him a thick file, "you're going to want to see this." Inside were records of past complaints against Henderson, accusations of excessive force, racial profiling, and verbal abuse. Most of the complaints had been quietly dismissed, buried under layers of bureaucracy. How did he get away with this for so long? Marcus asked, anger boiling beneath his calm exterior. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon, Tasha replied. The system protects its own. But with everything happening now, this might be the tipping point. Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. He knew this information could be a game changer. That evening, he held a meeting with several community leaders, sharing the findings and planning their next steps. We need to take this public, said one leader, a retired lawyer named James Carter. Expose not just Henderson, but the entire culture that enables people like him. As they strategized, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about Dacia anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had failed too many for too long. Dacia's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. She was no longer just a quiet girl who loved music. She was now a symbol of resistance, a voice for change. But with that newfound role came immense pressure. The school. She struggled to balance her classes with the constant attention. Reporters camped outside, hoping for a statement. Some classmates whispered behind her back, questioning her motives. One afternoon, as she sat in the library, Mia slid into the chair across from her. You okay? Mia asked. Dacia sighed, closing her textbook. I don't know. Sometimes I wish all this would just go away. Mia nodded. I get it. But Dacia, what you're doing, it matters. You're making a difference. Dacia smiled faintly. Thanks, Mia. I feel like I'm not strong enough for this. You are, Mia said firmly. You stood up there at that rally and spoke to hundreds of people. That's strength. Later that evening, Dacia sat in her room, her violin resting in her lap. She began to play, letting the music wash over her. It was a song her father had taught her, one that spoke of resilience and hope. As the notes filled the room, Dacia felt a spark reignite within her. She didn't choose this fight, but she wasn't going to back down. For herself, for her family, and for everyone who had ever been silenced, she would keep going. The auditorium was packed. Rows of seats were filled with students, parents, and community members, all gathered for an event titled Voices for Justice, a call to end discrimination. It was the largest public forum the town had ever hosted, and Dacia had been invited to be the keynote speaker. Backstage, she clutched the edges of the podium, her palms damp with sweat. Her father stood beside her, his strong hand resting on her shoulder. You've got this, Marcus said, his voice steady. Just speak from your heart. Dacia nodded, though her heart pounded like a drum. When the announcer called her name, she took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The applause that greeted her was thunderous, but it only made her anxiety worse. She reached the microphone and looked out over the crowd, their faces expectant. Good evening, she began, her voice trembling. My name is Dacia Williams. I'm 14 years old, and I've never done anything like this before. But I'm here because something happened to me that I can't ignore, and I don't think any of us should ignore. She paused, letting her words settle. The audience leaned in, captivated. A few weeks ago, I was stopped by a police officer while walking home. He humiliated me, searched me, and treated me like a criminal for no reason. It was the scariest moment of my life. And it wasn't just about what he did. It was about what it meant. Dacia's voice grew stronger as she spoke. She talked about the fear, the shame, and the deep sense of injustice she had felt. But she also spoke about hope, about the community that had rallied around her, about the power of standing up for what's right. When she finished, the crowd erupted in applause. Tears streamed down Dacia's face as she stepped back from the podium. She had done it not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. Tom Henderson sat in his living room, staring at the television. The broadcast from the forum played on the screen, and Dacia's voice echoed in his ears. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He humiliated me, searched me, and treated me like a criminal for no reason. He couldn't shake the look on her face, the pain, the fear, the strength. For the first time, he saw her not as a suspect, not as an abstract problem, but as a human being, a child. Lisa, his wife, entered the room, her face etched with worry. "Tom," she said softly, "you need to talk to someone. This isn't good for you." Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know where to start. Lisa, everything's falling apart. My job, my reputation, us." "Then fix it," Lisa said, her voice firmer. "You've spent your whole career justifying what you do, telling yourself it's about protecting people. But maybe it's time to protect someone else. Maybe it's time to own up to what you've done." Her words struck a nerve. Tom had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one with the power. But now, he felt powerless. The walls he had built around himself, walls of authority, pride, and denial, were crumbling. That night, for the first time in years, Tom sat down and wrote in a journal. He wrote about his childhood, about the lessons his father had drilled into him, about the prejudices he had absorbed without question. He wrote about the incident with Daisha, reliving every moment in excruciating detail. When he finished, he felt hollow, but also lighter. It was a step, a small one, but a step nonetheless. The investigation into Tom Henderson's conduct had reached its climax. The body cam footage, witness testimonies, and the history of complaints against him painted a damning picture. The police department had no choice but to recommend disciplinary action. Marcus wasn't satisfied. "This isn't just about Henderson," he said during a meeting with his legal team. "It's about the system that allowed him to act this way for years." The Williams family had filed a civil rights lawsuit, not only against Henderson but also against the police department for failing to hold him accountable. The lawsuit garnered national attention, with major news outlets covering the case. In court, Marcus and Angela sat beside their attorney, while Daisha watched from the gallery. The room was tense as the evidence was presented. Video clips of Henderson's interactions with Daisha, documents showing dismissed complaints, and testimony from witnesses who had seen the incident. Henderson's defense attorney argued that his actions were the result of split-second decisions made under the pressure of his job, but the prosecutor countered with a powerful statement. "Officer Henderson's actions were not the result of pressure," she said. "They were the result of prejudice, and prejudice has no place in law enforcement." The courtroom fell silent as the weight of her words settled. Marcus reached over and squeezed Angela's hand. It wasn't over yet, but they were closer to justice than they had ever been. The lawsuit and media attention had taken a toll on the Williams family. Daisha struggled to focus on school. Angela juggled her job and the endless stream of interviews, and Marcus found himself consumed by the fight for justice. One evening, Angela called for a family meeting. They gathered in the living room, the weight of the past weeks visible on their faces. "We need to talk," Angela began. "About us, about how we're going to move forward." Daisha looked down at her hands. "I don't even know what forward looks like anymore." "Neither do I," Angela admitted. "But I do know this: we can't let this situation define us. Yes, it's a fight we have to fight, but we also have to take care of each other." Marcus nodded. "Your mom's right. I've been so focused on the lawsuit, on the rallies, that I've lost sight of what matters most. You too." Daisha looked up, her eyes shining with tears. "I just want things to go back to normal." Angela reached over and pulled her daughter into a hug. "I know, sweetheart, and we'll get there. It's going to take time, but we'll get there." That night, for the first time in weeks, the Williams family sat down for dinner together. They laughed, shared stories, and for a few precious hours, the weight of the world felt a little lighter. In her room later, Daisha picked up her violin. She played softly, the melody filling the house. It was a song of resilience, a song of hope, and as she played, she felt the strength of her family, her community, and herself rising within her. It was a brisk morning when the press conference was announced. The media gathered in front of City Hall, cameras flashing and microphones poised. The Williams family sat in the front row, their expressions unreadable. This was the moment they had been waiting for, one that could either bring closure or reignite their pain. Tom Henderson stood at the podium, flanked by his attorney and chief Sarah Bennett. He looked older than his 42 years. His shoulders slumped under the weight of public scrutiny. The murmurs in the crowd fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," Tom began, his voice rough and hesitant. "To Daisha Williams and her family, I owe you an apology, a real apology, not just for my actions that day, but for the pain and humiliation I caused." His eyes briefly met Daisha's, and he faltered, looking down at his prepared statement. "That day, I acted on my biases, not on facts. I let fear and prejudice dictate my behavior, and I failed in my duty to protect and serve. I didn't see Daisha as a person, I saw a stereotype. And for that, I am deeply ashamed." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Marcus, who had prepared himself for a shallow, rehearsed apology, felt a flicker of surprise at Tom's honesty. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Tom continued, "but I want you to know that I'm committed to making things right. I've agreed to attend racial bias training and community outreach programs. I'll listen and learn, and I'll work to change. Not just for myself, but for the people I've hurt." Tom stepped back from the podium, his hands trembling. The crowd erupted into a mix of applause and murmured skepticism. As Tom walked away, he glanced at Daisha one last time. She didn't smile, but she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that gave him hope. The courtroom was packed as the judge prepared to deliver the final ruling on the Williams family's lawsuit. The atmosphere was tense, with reporters scribbling furiously and community members leaning forward in their seats. "The court finds Officer Thomas Henderson liable for the violation of Daisha Williams' civil rights," the judge announced. "The police department is also found liable for systemic negligence in addressing complaints of misconduct." A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a ripple of applause. Marcus gripped Angela's hand tightly, his eyes welling with tears. Daisha sat frozen, the words sinking in. The judge continued, "This court orders the department to implement mandatory racial bias training for all officers, establish an independent oversight committee, and pay damages to the Williams family. Officer Henderson will also face a 6-month suspension without pay and will be required to complete a rehabilitation program." As they exited the courthouse, reporters swarmed the Williams family, microphones thrust in their faces. Marcus spoke on their behalf, his voice steady but firm. "This is a step forward," he said. "But the fight isn't over. This isn't just about my daughter, it's about creating a system where every child, every person, is treated with dignity and respect." Daisha stood beside him, her head held high. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Tom sat in the first row of a small classroom, surrounded by other officers attending the mandatory racial bias training. The instructor, a passionate civil rights advocate named Dr. Elaine Carter, stood at the front of the room, her sharp gaze sweeping over the attendees. "Let's start with a question," Dr. Carter said. "How many of you think you're biased?" The room fell silent. Tom hesitated, then raised his hand. A few others followed suit. "Good," Dr. Carter said. "Acknowledging bias is the first step toward change. Now let's talk about how those biases affect the decisions you make and the lives they impact." For weeks, Tom attended the sessions, often staying after class to ask questions. He listened to stories from community members who had experienced discrimination, their pain and resilience leaving an indelible mark on him. Slowly, he began to see the world through their eyes. One afternoon, as part of a community outreach program, Tom visited a local youth center. He found himself face-to-face with a group of teenagers, many of whom looked at him with open distrust. Among them was Jamal, a 16-year-old who reminded Tom of his younger self, angry, defensive, and yearning to be understood. "Why should we trust you?" Jamal asked, his tone challenging. Tom took a deep breath. "Because I'm trying to be better," he said honestly. "And because you deserve better from people like me." The weeks turned into months, and slowly, Tom began to rebuild his life. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was a start. A year later, the community had transformed. The police department had implemented new policies, including body camera mandates, regular community forums, and stricter accountability measures. The Oversight Committee, chaired by Marcus, worked tirelessly to ensure transparency and fairness. Daisha had become a local hero. Her story inspired a wave of activism among young people, and she often spoke at schools and events. One day, after a particularly moving speech, a young girl approached her. "Miss Daisha," the girl said shyly, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Daisha knelt to the girl's level, smiling. "You can be anything you want to be, and if anyone tells you otherwise, you show them how strong you are." Meanwhile, Marcus and Angela watched their daughter with pride. Their family had weathered the storm, emerging stronger and more united than ever. As for Tom, he continued his journey of redemption. He remained involved in community programs, working to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. It wasn't about erasing his past. It was about building a better future. One evening, at a town hall meeting, Tom crossed paths with Daisha. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, Tom extended his hand. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice quiet but sincere. Daisha hesitated, then shook his hand. "I know," she said. "Just keep trying." As they parted ways, the town hall erupted into discussion, the sound of voices blending together into a symphony of change. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't finished, but it was a start. And for Daisha, Marcus, and the entire community, that was enough.